Did you know that your brain contains about 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synaptic connections? There may be as many as 1,000 billion or 1 trillion neurons in the entire nervous system, which is more than the number of stars in the Milky Way. As impressive as these statistics are, the ways in which the brain and nervous system receives, processes, and transmits information is even more fascinating.
The location of a neuron and its function in that region of the brain or body determine the meaning of a particular nerve signal. For example, the meaning of a signal from the optic nerve located in the back of your eye is different than the meaning of the signal going to muscles in your arm. Even so, there is very little difference between the ways these neurons fire. It's all about electrochemical signals. There are 5 main structures or groups of structures that make up every neuron. Dendrites receive signals from sensory receptors and other neurons. Depending on the frequency and pattern of these signals, the receiving neuron either fires or remains quiet. The cell body, or soma, is the part of the neuron that contains the nucleus and all the other structures common to cells that keep them alive. The soma also integrates signals received by multiple dendrites and passes them down the single nerve fiber, the axon. The axon carries the electrochemical signal through the neuron to the opposite end. In some parts of the body, such as the spinal cord, a single axon might be several feet long. The myelin sheath surrounds the axon, insulating it from surrounding cells and tissues, and making signal transmission faster and more efficient. The terminal buttons release neurotransmitters, the chemical signals that neurons use to communicate with other neurons and various other types of cells. Neurons generally transmit signals only in one direction, from the dendrites through the soma, along the axon, and onto the terminal buttons. Neurons don't fire constantly. For a neuron to fire, its dendrites and soma must receive a sufficient number and frequency of excitatory signals from other cells. This is analogous to the firing of a gun. It requires a certain amount of stimuli, like pressure on the trigger, in order to start the process, but once it has begun, it occurs the same way every time and can't be interrupted or reversed. This is known as the all or none law. A neuron is both surrounded by and filled with fluid, and this fluid contains charged particles called ions. When a neuron is at rest, there's a greater concentration of negative ions inside the cell than outside the cell. This produces a polarized state called the neuron's resting potential. In other words, it has the potential to fire. Excitatory signals cause positive ions to move into the neuron. If the cell receives enough of these signals, it reaches its action potential. This depolarization is the point of no return. Positive ions now flow freely across the membrane and set in motion a domino effect that propels the action potential down the axon to the terminal buttons. As soon as the action potential has passed, the neuron quickly returns to its resting state. Positive ions flow back across the membrane and restore polarity. After a brief refractory period, during which it's unable to fire, the neuron is once again primed and ready. When the electrochemical signal has reached the terminal buttons, the process is by no means complete. In a way, this is only the beginning. The primary role of neurons is to communicate with other neurons and cells of other tissues. Neurons are separated from each other by a small fluid-filled space called the synapse. The terminal buttons produce chemical signals called neurotransmitters that cross the synapse and are received by receptors on the dendrites of other neurons. Neurotransmitters function like keys that fit only specific locks. If the key doesn't fit, it won't attach to the receptor, and the signal will go unreceived. If it does fit a receptor, it will convey one of 2 messages: fire or don't fire. Depending on the distribution of these excitatory and inhibitory signals, the receiving neuron will either remain at its resting potential or will reach its action potential, the state of no return, and fire.
As complex as this process might seem, one of the most striking things about it is how common it is. Everything we do, see, think, and hear is controlled by this process. It doesn't matter if you're feeling the sting of a bee, listening to music, or writing a love letter. This basic mechanism makes it all possible. Just think about it. No matter what you're doing, much of it comes down to nerve impulses.